I was walking past a row of trading desks in a quiet corner of a financial district recently. The atmosphere was heavy, almost stagnant. Most of the monitors were a sea of flickering colors, reflecting a market that couldn't quite decide which way to fall, leaving most traders slumped in their chairs, nursing lukewarm coffees. But there was one desk where the energy was jarringly different. A young guy was leaned so far into his screen, his nose was nearly touching the glass, his fingers frantically scrolling through a technical white paper on GPU architecture. On his screen, a single ticker was defying the laws of gravity. While the rest of the A-share market was treading water, more threads was screaming upward, its valuation ballooning toward the 4,500 billion RMB mark as the price tore through 940 yuan. I asked him what he was seeing that everyone else was missing. He didn't talk about PE ratios or cash flow. He just pointed at a headline about domestic photolithography breakthroughs and muttered, "This is the one, this is the king." There was a feverish, almost religious conviction in his voice, as if he wasn't looking at a stock, but at a national savior. What was striking, however, was his reaction when I brought up the actual complexities of chip fabrication, or the sheer distance still left to cover in the global tech race. He didn't offer a technical rebuttal. Instead, his face took on a look of defiant satisfaction. To him, the soaring stock price wasn't just a financial gain, it was a psychological victory, a hit back against external pressures. That sudden, intense focus on a single hero company amidst a volatile market landscape left me wondering, is this 4,500 billion yuan surge a calculated bet on a technological breakthrough, or is it a symptom of a market so desperate for a domestic miracle that it has stopped looking at the data altogether? To understand why more threads has become the demon king of the A-shares, we have to look past the charts and into the collective psyche of an industry under siege.
That is the perfect way to frame this. That story, that feeling on the trading floor, it really gets to the heart of what we're going to talk about. It's not just about numbers.
No, it's about belief. And our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack that belief. We need to figure out how this market fever connects to the hard technological reality on the ground.
Exactly. We're looking at what many analysts are calling an ecosystem war. It's one of the most complex and high-stakes competitions playing out right now.
That's right. So we're going to get into the foundations of this whole battle. We'll unpack the completely different investment models that are fueling this tech race.
Then we'll zoom in on the core battleground, which is AI chips, exactly where companies like More Threads are operating.
And finally, we'll look at the immediate fallout, how this is reshaping supply chains across Southeast Asia, hitting key hubs like Singapore, Malaysia, and then also places like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand.
We want to understand the structural forces at play. What's driving this competition, and what does it really mean for the future of technology, not just in China or the US, but globally?
Okay, so let's start with that term you used, ecosystem war. It sounds much bigger than a typical trade dispute.
It is. We absolutely have to contextualize the pressure, the siege, as you put it. Analysts use that term, ecosystem war, for a very specific reason.
That's the distinction.
It elevates the conflict way beyond, simple tariffs or minor trade spats. This isn't about that. This is a long-term, high-pressure strategic game.
And it involves the entire tech stack.
The entire value chain. Everything from the specialized chemicals and gases used in a fab, all the way up to the AI algorithms that run on the final piece of silicon. Every single link is part of the battlefield.
So if it's a war for the entire ecosystem, what's the ultimate objective for each side? It has to be more than just market share.
Oh, absolutely. When you boil it all down, the core conflict is technological hegemony versus technological sovereignty.
Okay, let's break that down. Hegemony first.
The U.S. strategy is fundamentally about maintaining its technological leadership, and it does that by leveraging the critical high-value choke points that it still controls.
So we're talking about things that are incredibly difficult to replicate.
Exactly. The most famous example is advanced lithography equipment, the machines from ASML that you need to print the smallest, most powerful circuits. And the other big one is specialized software called electronic design automation, or EDA.
You literally cannot design a modern chip without EDA software.
You can't. It's essential.
Right.
So that's the U.S. strategy. On the other side, you have China. Their goal is, it's absolute technological self-reliance. They are pursuing what they call innovation superiority and, ultimately, industrial dominance. The goal is to make those external choke points completely irrelevant.
I've heard the Chinese perspective on all this pressure summarized in a really interesting phrase. I don't seem to see it as a death blow.
No, and that's the critical psychological and strategic lens here. The dominant view among Chinese industrial analysts is something they call short-term pressure, long-term acceleration.
Okay. Short-term pressure, long-term acceleration. What does that mean in practice?
The idea is that U.S. export restrictions, well, they definitely create immediate problems. Supply chain headaches, project delays, that's the short-term pressure.
Sure, that makes sense.
But fundamentally, they see it as an involuntary but incredibly powerful catalyst. It forces them to innovate internally. That's the long-term acceleration. The pressure is actually speeding up their push for self-reliance.
Can you give us a concrete example of that acceleration effect in action?
The most visible and probably the most powerful example is Huawei.
Of course.
After being hit with round after round of really intense U.S. sanctions, they didn't just collapse. They didn't just survive. They doubled down. They poured billions into building a fully domestic supply chain for their chips.
And we've seen the results of that with their new phones and AI chips.
We have. We see it with the remarkable development of their Ascend AI chips. The U.S. pressure essentially validated the argument that a complete self-contained system was an urgent necessity. So they accelerated everything investment into domestic EDA tools, specialized materials, and most critically, those breakthroughs in photolithography that the trader you mentioned was so excited about. They're trying to solve the very bottlenecks the U.S. was using against them.
It seems like a very rational strategic response. But from the outside, the U.S. policy itself has looked incredibly unpredictable lately. It tightens, then it seems to loosen a bit, then it clamps down even harder. That volatility must be difficult to plan around.
It creates a lot of tactical confusion, for sure. But I think for the Chinese planners, the strategic direction from the U.S. is crystal clear, even if the tactics change month to month.
So the volatility is part of the strategy.
It's a major feature of this current phase, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the shifts we've seen. At one point, there was talk of rescinding the Biden-era AI diffusion rule, which was an attempt to create a clear, tiered global export system.
Right.
But then, almost right away, the focus shifted back to tightening controls on semiconductor manufacturing equipment, specifically closing older loopholes that foreign fabs operating in China were using.
And the chip exports themselves have been a dizzying game of chess. It's hard to keep track.
It really is. We saw that temporary relaxation period earlier this year. It allowed companies like Nvidia and AMD to export slightly less powerful, de-featured versions of their AI chips to China, the H20 and the MI308.
But there was a catch, right?
A very big catch. It came with what you could call a geopolitical tax. The exporting companies had to pay a percentage of their China revenue back to the U.S. government.
Right.
It's a very direct, very explicit form of economic statecraft.
Wow. And then what happened?
Then, almost immediately, the screws tightened again. The U.S. outright denied the export of the newest, most cutting-edge Blackwell chips. So this constant adjustment, this tweaking, it's all an attempt to find the sweet spot between hindering China's AI progress and, still allowing U.S. firms to access a lucrative market.
So the U.S. is using its technological bottlenecks as leverage. But China isn't just taking it. They're responding with their own economic tools.
That's where you see this entrenchment of economic statecraft on both sides. China has responded with very targeted reciprocal actions.
Careful.
Well, in one really notable move, they launched an anti-dumping investigation, and it specifically targeted analog chips, which are made on older, more mature nodes, like 40 nanometers and above, that were being imported from the U.S.
What's the signal there?
The signal is that these economic tools are now just part of normal reciprocity. It's tit for tat. And even more directly, they placed export restrictions on crucial rare earth elements like gallium and germanium.
Materials that are essential for high-tech manufacturing.
Absolutely. Essential for advanced chips, for optoelectronics, for all sorts of things. This moves way beyond a simple trade negotiation. It's turning foundational industrial inputs into geopolitical levers.
So if the U.S. tactics are volatile and shifting, what's the one constant, the fixed strategic trajectory on China's side?
That trajectory is completely fixed, regardless of any tactical shifts from Washington. The long-term goal has not changed one bit. Achieve technological sovereignty, then innovation superiority, and ultimately global market domination.
And this is deeply embedded in their whole industrial policy.
Deeply. There's an analogy that analysts there often use, which I think captures the motivation perfectly. They say, you should not build a house on someone else's foundation.
That's a powerful image.
It is, because it explains the deep-seated belief that relying on foreign supply chains for core technologies like lithography or EDA software is an existential vulnerability. Their entire mission is to eliminate that vulnerability by building a complete, resilient domestic ecosystem from the ground up. And that mission is what gives so many investors, like that trader you saw, that almost religious conviction in a company like More Threads.
That context is so important, because building an entire technological house from scratch, that requires an absolutely unprecedented mobilization of resources. Which brings us directly to how these two giants are funding this massive competition. The models are completely different.
Night and day.
Let's start with the hard data. Looking at the period from, say, 2020 to 2024, if we just look at the amount of capital poured into semiconductors, the difference in sheer volume is, well, it's dark.
It is. Over that 4-year window, China's cumulative primary market investment in semiconductors was significantly higher than the total in the U.S. But here's the really critical insight. It's not just about the total dollar amount.
What else should we be looking at?
The number of deals. The total number of investment transactions was actually pretty similar between the two countries.
Okay, so similar number of bets were placed, but China spent vastly more capital in total.
Yeah.
What does that tell you about the average investment size?
It tells you that China's average investment per project, particularly for small and mid-sized companies and early-stage ventures, is structurally much, much higher than the U.S. average.
So they're writing bigger checks for younger companies.
Exactly. And that points to a sustained, deliberate, strategic focus on cultivating those foundational and early-stage companies, even if they have long development timelines and carry a lot of risk. This is the hallmark of what we call China's state-guided pseudo-IDM model.
Okay, that's a mouthful. Pseudo-IDM model. Let's unpack that. We know it's market-driven, but state-commanded. How does that system actually deploy capital? What's the role of local governments?
The system is, well, it's pretty unique. It manages to decentralize the execution while keeping the strategy highly centralized.
How so?
The central government in Beijing sets the big national priorities. We need to dominate in memory chips. We need domestic lithography. But the implementation, the actual investment, is delegated down to provincial and municipal authorities.
And these local governments act like VCs.
They act like incredibly powerful state-backed venture capitalists. They operate what are called guidance funds. And these funds are explicitly told to foster fierce competition. This often leads to what looks like large-scale duplication. You might have 3 different cities all pouring money into competing domestic memory companies at the same time.
Wait, I have to push back on that. Duplication, overcapacity. That sounds like the definition of inefficiency in a normal capitalist system. How can that possibly be strategic?
It's what you could call an intentional inefficiency. And you're right, it's not about short-term profit maximization. The goal is completely different. The goal is national industrial consolidation and long-term resilience.
So it's a kind of Darwinian process.
It's a brutal, state-sponsored Darwinian process. This fierce internal competition weeds out the weaker firms, the ones that can't innovate fast enough or scale effectively. The survivors, the ones that prove their technological resilience and market viability, are then consolidated and backed with massive state resources to become national champions.
Like SMIC in manufacturing.
Exactly, like SMIC or the Huawei Group or YMTC in the memory sector. This process of creating multiple winning firms and then centralizing them to cover design, manufacturing, and packaging across the whole nation, it effectively mimics the structure of a traditional integrated device manufacturer, an IDM like Intel, hence the pseudo-IDM label.
So what looks like wasteful spending early on is actually a strategic filter to guarantee that a government-backed winner will emerge in the end. That explains the market's conviction. The state is essentially underwriting the outcome.
Precisely. And the scale of the government's financial commitment is just staggering. It backs up this entire structure. Between 2020 and 2024, government-backed capital accounted for $47.9 billion. That's a staggering 91% of the total investment in China's semiconductor sector.
91%.
And crucially, that money isn't just going to build giant factories. It's being aggressively channeled into early stage and growth stage projects. It supports the entire innovation lifecycle from basic R&D all the way to a market launch.
Which means the state is willing to take on the kind of high-risk, long-term bets that traditional private venture capital would never touch, especially in deep tech with these 10 or 15-year development cycles.
They are absolutely willing to absorb that risk. And they've even written it into policy. The government knows that private VCs will avoid seed stage funding for foundational tech because the time to return is just too long.
So how do they counteract that?
They've implemented some pretty pioneering local policies. For example, the Chengdu High-Tech Zone allows its government seed funds to incur losses of up to 80% on their investments.
80%.
And the Guangzhou Development Zone goes even further. They permit a full 100% principal loss on their seed stage direct investments.
So they're essentially saying, it's okay if this fails. The attempt itself is worth the investment.
That's the clear signal. The capital is designed to cultivate the foundational technologies they need for sovereignty, even if the immediate financial return is negative. This full life cycle support, from a seed idea to a national champion, is what makes it so fundamentally different from the U.S. model.
Okay, let's make that contrast now. Let's look at the U.S. model, especially with the CHEPS Act influencing how capital is being allocated. How does the U.S. approach differ from being an equity partner willing to lose 100% of its investment?
The U.S. government, for the most part, acts as a passive subsidy provider. It's not really an active equity partner in the same way.
So it's grants, not investments.
Primarily, yes. The CHEPS Act allocated about $36.7 billion in grants and tax credits, and it's designed mainly to incentivize one thing: manufacturing on U.S. soil.
And that funding tends to go to the big players.
It heavily favors the incumbents, the large technology giants. We're talking Intel, TSMC, Samsung. The money is for building domestic fabrication plants or fabs. The goal is supply chain resilience through onshoring manufacturing capacity.
So instead of the government spreading capital around to take risks on dozens of innovative startups, it's concentrated on giving incentives to a few massive established companies. What kind of constraints does that create for the broader U.S. ecosystem?
It creates some pretty significant structural constraints. It's one of the reasons the ecosystem is arguably less diversified. Because the capital is so concentrated in these grants for incumbents, there's very little direct government support left for the early stage and mid-sized fabless startups.
The smaller companies that are designing the next generation of specialized chips.
Exactly. The U.S. ecosystem relies very heavily on those incumbents eventually acquiring this successful smaller firms. That's the primary exit strategy.
So in effect, if you're a brilliant U.S. startup, your most likely path to growth is being bought by Intel or Nvidia, not necessarily scaling up independently with deep government backing. How does that reliance on M&A affect this system?
Well, it inherently drives a certain kind of risk aversion in the private VC culture. If the main exit path is an acquisition, VCs are generally less willing to pour in the massive patient capital you need to build out foundational infrastructure like a totally new kind of EDA tool or a complex piece of manufacturing equipment.
Because the acquisition payout might not justify that huge initial investment and the long years of risk.
Precisely. That dynamic kind of hinders ecosystem diversification and forces a reliance on the big players for innovation. It's a sharp contrast to China's system, which is actively trying to cultivate multiple independent, competing national players.
And this divergence in funding models is also really visible in what technologies each country chooses to prioritize with its money.
Absolutely. The focus is quite different. The U.S. invests heavily in what you'd call frontier technologies. About 44% of its projects are in areas like advanced AI chips, quantum computing, and photonic chips.
Chasing the cutting edge.
Right. And while China is definitely involved in those areas, its strategic priority is different. It's more about strengthening the entire industrial base and building capacity across the full supply chain. Only about 21% of their projects are categorized as frontier tech. So you could say the U.S. is chasing the very tip of the spear, but its capital model is less supportive of the broad industrial base needed to make the whole spear stronger. China is focused on the entire weapon.
That focus on the entire industrial base brings us right back to why a company like More Threads, which is focused on GPU architecture, can generate so much excitement. The core battlefield today, where all this capital and strategy converges, is the AI chip.
The AI chip is the absolute strategic center of gravity. For China, the strategy is laser-focused on solving its acute dependence on foreign hardware.
Specifically on Nvidia and its SUDI software ecosystem.
Exactly. Breaking that dependence on high-performance training chips from Nvidia and the whole CUDA software world around it. That is seen as a prerequisite for true technological sovereignty.
And the demand for these high-performance domestic chips isn't just a future hope. It's being driven right now by massive corporate rollouts of their own large language models.
That's the key. The demand is real and it's exploding. The rise of sophisticated domestic models like DeepSeek V2, ByteDance's Dubao, and Kimi from Moonshot AI has created a guaranteed internal market for domestic compute.
And we are seeing tangible results from that demand pull.
We are. Huawei's Ascend 910 chip, which is a direct competitor in the AI training space, is planning to double its production capacity by 2026. This scaling isn't waiting for export markets. It's being driven by domestic tech giants who desperately need alternatives to foreign chips to stay competitive.
But the challenge, as we've discussed, isn't just building a chip that's fast. It's building the entire software ecosystem around it to challenge the dominance of CUDA. This is where that idea of system thinking becomes so important.
And that's probably the most sophisticated part of China's whole AI strategy. They are proactively trying to solve the software moat problem. They've formed something called the Model Chip Ecosystem Innovation Alliance.
What does that do?
It's a strategic coordination body. It brings together key domestic hardware players like Huawei's Ascend and, yes, more Threads, with the companies developing the AI models. The goal is to align new model development, like the Jipai-Xingchen inference model, directly with the architectures of their domestic hardware from day one.
What does that alignment mean in practice? It sounds like it's more than just a software patch to make it compatible.
It's a deep, fundamental redesign of the algorithms. Instead of trying to just drop a Chinese chip into a workflow that's been optimized for decades around Nvidia's CUDA, they're rebuilding the whole software stack from the ground up.
So new compilers, new libraries, a whole thing.
The whole thing. They are redesigning the core algorithms to maximize the performance and efficiency of their specific domestic silicon. It's an incredibly complex and time-consuming process, but they see it as absolutely essential for long-term technological independence.
This all leads to a really interesting strategic pivot. If chasing Moore's law head-on, shrinking transistors down to sub-3 nanometers is just too hard because of the lithography bottleneck, where is the focus of innovation shifting?
The big shift is toward what's being called more than more innovation.
More than more.
Right. It means instead of just making transistors smaller, you compete fiercely in areas like advanced packaging, chiplet architectures, and 3D integration. These are strategically favorable areas for China because, compared to the enormous hurdle of building a sub-3 nanometer fab, the technological playing field in advanced packaging is much more level globally.
Can you just briefly explain for our listeners why chiplet architecture and 3D integration are such powerful workarounds?
Certainly. So Moore's law is all about cramming more transistors onto one single monolithic piece of silicon. Chiplets break that paradigm.
Oh.
Instead of one huge, expensive, and difficult to make chip, you create smaller, specialized functional blocks, the chiplets, and then you integrate them together very tightly using advanced packaging techniques.
And that gives you more flexibility.
Huge flexibility. It lets you mix and match different process nodes. You could use a cutting-edge 5 nanometer chiplet for your main compute cores, but a cheaper, older 28 nanometer chiplet for your input-output functions. It dramatically increases your manufacturing yield and brings down the cost.
And 3D integration takes that even further.
It does. It stacks these chiplets vertically, one on top of the other. That dramatically reduces the physical distance between the processing units and the memory, which gives you a huge boost in speed and power efficiency, all without needing the absolute latest, most expensive lithography for the entire package.
That is a very clever pivot, using packaging ingenuity to get around a manufacturing roadblock. But even with that, you still need foundational manufacturing capacity. Are there any signs of genuine breakthroughs in the most challenging upstream areas, specifically in lithography, which is the ultimate bottleneck?
Yes, there are significant signs of progress, and it reflects intense high-level policy attention. A lot of R&D has been focused on photonic sources, the light generators you need to print the circuits.
And what's the news there?
Sources are noting progress in developing a fully solid-state 193 nanometer deep ultraviolet, or DUV, light source, and also in advancing a 13.5 nanometer extreme ultraviolet, or EUV, light source, using a specific technology called discharge-produced plasma, or DPP.
Those sound like major milestones. But why is it still considered an immense challenge? If they have the light source, what's so hard about building the rest of the machine?
The complexity is, it's all in the full system integration and achieving commercial viability. A light source is just one critical component. A complete factory-ready lithography machine that can run 20/47 has hundreds of thousands of other specialized components.
Like what?
Perfect vibration control systems, incredibly precise optical lenses and mirrors that have to be synchronized, defect detection systems, chemical handling, a wafer stage that has to be aligned with picometer accuracy. The list goes on and on.
So the gap between a successful lab demo of one part and a viable commercial product is enormous.
It's a huge chasm. It involves solving system engineering challenges across optics, mechanics, software, and chemistry that take decades to master. China has some of the pieces, but integrating them into a competitive industrial tool that a fab can rely on, that remains the final immense hurdle.
So while they're still pushing for those advanced breakthroughs, the bigger manufacturing strategy seems to be about achieving scale and cost advantages in the nodes where they can compete globally right now. The mature nodes. This is what some are calling the second China shock.
The expectation is very clear. The goal is future dominance in mature node processes, so 10 nanometers and above, as well as in specialized memory and analog chip production. China's relentless capacity growth in these segments is projected to create cost advantages that will crowd out global competitors.
Because the state-guided investment model allows them to achieve a scale that others just can't match.
Exactly. The sheer scale and consolidation power mean they can produce high-quality mature node chips at a unit cost that will be very, very difficult for others to compete with.
And how is the government making sure there's a captive, guaranteed market for this massive new output? How do they ensure the survival of firms like More Threads, even if they aren't globally competitive right away?
This is the other half of the strategy, the essential policy mechanism. Strategic demand-side pull. The government uses powerful procurement mandates,
Forcing state-owned companies to buy domestic.
Yes. For example, a policy that started in Shanghai and has since been extended nationwide requires state-funded data centers to source a significant portion, often 50% of their chips and equipment from domestic producers.
That creates a massive foundational market overnight.
It guarantees it. It guarantees a market for firms like Huawei, Biren, and Cambricon. By leveraging public procurement for smart cities, digital government projects, and all the state-owned enterprises, the state ensures a continuous, high-volume demand. That allows these firms to scale up, refine their technology, and eventually achieve cost parity. The fact that keywords like manufacturing, advanced process, and photolithography keep showing up in high-level policy reports just confirms the sustained focus on solving these foundational bottlenecks.
This intense internal push is having an immediate and really profound effect on the region, especially in Southeast Asia. This whole geopolitical fight is now dictating where and how investment flows.
The immediate trigger for this whole realignment was the U.S. Commerce Department's draft export controls on advanced AI chips.
The Nvidia H100s, the AMD MI300Xs.
Exactly, and those regulations were explicitly designed to prevent diversion. The goal was to stop these high-performance chips from being rerouted through intermediary companies in other countries before ending up in what the U.S. calls Tier 3 nations, which includes China.
And this new compliance framework led to an official reclassification for some key countries in the region.
Correct. Malaysia and Thailand were both reclassified as Tier 2 countries under this U.S. framework, and that's a critical distinction.
Why is that so important?
Because it imposes much more stringent compliance and documentation requirements on any advanced chips being exported to them. Companies now have to show a much higher level of due diligence to prove that these chips won't be transferred to sanctioned entities or used for prohibited purposes.
So if compliance is the new name of the game, which types of companies in Southeast Asia are best positioned to actually thrive in this new hyper-regulated environment?
The winners are the firms whose entire business model aligns with verification and supply chain security. So, for example, semiconductor testing and assembly companies suddenly become hugely strategic assets.
Like Unisem in Malaysia.
Unisem is the perfect example. As Malaysia's largest semiconductor tester, its strategic importance has just skyrocketed. Their services are now indispensable for ensuring that chips meet these new Tier 2 compliance rules before they get packaged and shipped out. They provide that critical chain of custody verification.
And what about outside of the factory floor? Who benefits in logistics and transport?
The big logistics giants are also doing very well. A firm like Singapore's CWT Limited, which specializes in managing these complex, high-value tech supply chains, is now seen as a preferred, trusted partner for U.S. tech firms.
Because they can guarantee a clean route.
They can provide vetted shipping routes and rigorous tracking that prevents diversion, which is exactly what the new regulations demand. Their ability to guarantee a compliant supply chain makes them an essential middleman for U.S. tech exports into the whole region.
So that shows how compliance is creating new winners.
Yeah.
But what about the risks? Who is now exposed by this compliance hammer?
The exposure is really centered on any infrastructure that relies on U.S.-made components but doesn't have the necessary regulatory validation. So regional data center REITs, cloud providers, if they haven't secured the proper certifications, they are facing much higher costs and a real vulnerability to U.S. penalties, especially after the August 2025 deadline expires.
Is there a specific example of that risk we can point to?
Yes. The sources highlight a critical case involving Alibaba's data centers in Malaysia.
Okay.
These facilities, as of now, don't have the necessary validated end user or VEU validation from the U.S. Commerce Department. The VEU status is basically a regulatory stamp of approval. It allows certain facilities in non-sanctioned countries to receive specific U.S. origin technologies.
So without that VEU stamp, they're in a precarious position.
A very precarious position. Those data centers face a lot of uncertainty about their future access to advanced U.S. chips and services. It potentially exposes them to sanctions if regulators even suspect diversion might be happening. It's a perfect illustration of how geopolitics and compliance are now fundamentally reshaping infrastructure investment across all of Southeast Asia.
So while the U.S. is applying this compliance hammer, China is simultaneously pursuing its own external circulation strategy, using its tech giants to drive digital transformation and AI integration across ASEAN. Let's look at that crucial case study of cloud infrastructure in Indonesia and Vietnam.
This is China's countermove, in a way. The strategy is to use technology partnerships to support the region's own development goals. And the strategic agreements between Indonesia's largest digital company, GoTo Group, and major Chinese cloud providers, Tencent Cloud and Alibaba Cloud, are a prime example.
And these are significant commitments.
Very significant. They're aimed at boosting Indonesia's digital economy and supporting its Golden Indonesia 2045 vision for technological advancement.
Let's talk numbers. How big are these commitments, and what are they actually building?
The commitments are substantial and multi-year. Tencent Cloud, for example, is committing $500 million in infrastructure and investment in Indonesia by 2030. A key part of that is building a third internet data center, or IDC, to expand their capacity there.
And Alibaba?
Alibaba Cloud already has 3 data centers in the country. Their commitment is more focused on human capital. They've pledged to double the number of local tech talents they train, from 400,000 to 800,000 people by 2033. They're even setting up a dedicated skills center at a major university. It shows a focus not just on hardware, but on building the local talent pool.
What's the main driver for a local giant like GoTo to partner so deeply with Chinese providers for this kind of critical infrastructure?
For them, the primary driver is data sovereignty and security. By partnering with providers who are building deep local infrastructure, GoTo can ensure that all of its user data stays onshore inside Indonesia.
Which is a big national priority for many countries now.
A huge priority. This move supports their national data sovereignty goals, it enhances security, and importantly, it strengthens the core digital infrastructure that supports Indonesia's massive sector of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. It's a symbiotic relationship that deeply embeds Chinese high-performance computing into the local economy.
And this digital expansion is then feeding this accelerating demand for localized AI applications across these emerging digital economies like Indonesia and Vietnam.
Absolutely. There's a powerful synergy happening. The build-out of this high-performance computing infrastructure, mostly by these Chinese tech giants, is enabling the local development and deployment of large language models, or LLMs.
Models that are customized for local languages and cultures.
Exactly, which enables really precise multisensory interactions. This capability is positioning smart devices, whether it's phones, fintech apps, or logistics tools, as these highly efficient interfaces for intelligent interaction. And that, in turn, drives a massive new wave of demand for both the cloud infrastructure and the localized AI models that run on it. China is essentially providing the full stack, the infrastructure, the hardware, and the talent pipeline to capture that regional demand.
We've looked at the immediate pressure and the capital war. Let's try to synthesize this now into the long-term structural implications. How is this competition physically reshaping the global supply chain, especially through frameworks like RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership?
Well, the chip war is acting as this massive reallocator of production and value. Since the main battle is over high-end design and advanced manufacturing, the dynamic is pushing investment and activity toward Asia's downstream and midstream nodes.
So assembly, testing, legacy chip production.
Exactly. And the hubs in East and Southeast Asia are strategically positioned to capture all of that reconfiguration. RCEP provides the policy framework to formalize these new partnerships.
How does RCEP specifically facilitate that shift?
RCEP provides a really crucial policy umbrella for Chinese firms. It lets them extend their ecosystems and bypass some of the direct bilateral friction with the U.S. It facilitates strategic alliances and joint investments with the ASEAN nations.
So it encourages deeper regional integration.
It does. For instance, the official China-Malaysia dialogue has explicitly named semiconductors, AI, and new energy as priority pillars for high-quality development. That kind of policy signal tells Chinese firms that localizing production, setting up joint ventures, and doing M&A in the region is strategically supported. It allows them to build a more resilient, geographically dispersed ecosystem.
Which raises a really fascinating tension. If this regional cooperation and ecosystem integration really takes off, what does that mean for the long-term structural impact of something like the U.S. TPS Act on major Asian players like the big firms in South Korea?
That is the critical question that analysts are debating right now. On one hand, the Shia PPS creates huge short-term pressure to relocate and build new fabs in the U.S.
Sure, there are billions in incentives.
But the long-term structural impact on those major regional players, like the Korean memory or foundry firms, may actually be limited if integration and innovation continue to advance so rapidly within the broader Asian network using frameworks like RCEP.
Because their business is global.
Their business is global. And if the Asian market offers them predictable demand, strong regional partnerships, and access to cost-efficient supply chains, they may prioritize maintaining that regional advantage over fully relocating their core operations to the U.S.
So if we follow these two industrial steamrollers, the state-guided Chinese model and the incumbent-focused U.S. model on their current very divergent paths, what does the consensus say the future of global competition will actually look like? Are we heading for one unified market or something more fractured?
The strong consensus is that we're evolving toward a tiered competition model. The global market is going to bifurcate structurally.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means the high-end segment, the absolute bleeding edge, the sub-3 nanometer processes, and the whole complex software world around it, like CUDA, will almost inevitably develop along two separate parallel trajectories with distinct standards. One led by the U.S. and its allies, the other by China.
And these two high-end systems won't be interoperable?
Not in any meaningful way, no.
So what happens to the rest of the chip market? The vast majority of chips aren't at the bleeding edge.
That's the other tier. The low and mid-range segment, the mature nodes, 10 nanometer and above, plus all the specialized chips for power management, analog functions, sensors, that segment will compete directly in shared global markets.
And that's where China expects to have a huge advantage.
A massive, decisive advantage. Thanks to its cost-efficient manufacturing, its guaranteed domestic scale, and its ability to consolidate capacity. This is where we'll see that second China shock of low-cost, high-volume hardware production flooding the globe. So a world of two standards for the high-end, but intense, scale-driven competition at the mature, essential manufacturing levels.
This entire industrial arms race, no matter which model you're using, it all depends on one final foundational pillar: talent. Scaling these strategies requires an immense, highly specialized human capital base. What are the structural challenges in finding and keeping that talent on both sides?
Talent remains the enduring structural challenge for both countries, and it may be the ultimate constraint that determines which strategy succeeds.
Let's start with China.
The Chinese government recognizes that it can't rely solely on its own university system or on sporadic national talent programs. So their strategy is shifting toward a much more targeted, platform-based integration of global expertise directly into their domestic innovation efforts.
What does platform-based integration look like in practice?
It means creating specialized centers and programs like the Kunming China program. These focus on integrating global experts through specific, short-term research projects and high-impact partnerships, rather than requiring them to emigrate full-time. It's about leveraging global talent flexibility and directing that knowledge transfer into their domestic platforms and national champions.
And on the U.S. side, they're facing similar structural issues, which seems counterintuitive given their technological leadership.
It does seem counterintuitive, but the constraints are systemic. The U.S. continues to face chronic shortages of engineering and semiconductor talent. This is partly due to inconsistent federal support for academic research over the years and a heavy reliance on external funding.
But the most critical issue is immigration.
It is. Immigration frictions, visa uncertainties, long processing times, restrictive policies. All of this creates real uncertainty for the top foreign nationals who are trained in U.S. universities. It hinders the long-term retention of the very same skilled workforce the CHIPS Act is trying to cultivate. These human capital constraints ultimately limit the sector's future capacity, despite all the existing advantages the U.S. has in design and EDA.
So let's bring this all the way back to where we started, back to that trading desk and the feverish conviction around a stock like More Threads. We've seen that the price surge was Well, it was less about immediate financial fundamentals and much more about the market acting as a kind of barometer.
A barometer for these immense geopolitical and industrial policy pressures. It was a collective expression of a national hope for technological sovereignty.
And that pressure has forced China into this aggressive, state-guided, full-spectrum investment model, the pseudo-IDM. It's creating an internally competitive but vertically integrated system that's laser-focused on solving those foundational bottlenecks in AI and manufacturing. And at the same time, we see this outward-looking strategy driving massive, localized AI and cloud infrastructure across economies like Indonesia and Vietnam.
And the immediate global consequence is a market that's splitting in two. Geopolitical compliance is now dictating which regional hubs, like Malaysia and Singapore, can thrive in the vetted U.S.-aligned supply chains.
Even as the broader Asian network uses frameworks like RCEP to structurally reallocate production toward the midstream and downstream nodes in places like Vietnam and Thailand.
The ultimate measure of success in this new ecosystem war may not be who controls the bleeding edge of the sub-3 nanometer process, but rather which country can successfully cultivate a self-sustaining, multi-layered domestic market from materials and equipment all the way up through localized AI applications that is strategically insulated from external control and globally competitive in scale.